Hello there, this is Deborah Irene with update number 12 to Someday I Will Write. This evening I wanted to give you a little summary synopsis of my book, Someday I Will Write, just to give you a better idea as to how I brought this all together. You know, I've said that this book is for readers and it's for writers, and you may be wondering, well, how can it be for both? Well, first of all, I am a storyteller. I tell stories of everyday life and real life adventures. And so this book is a collection of my stories that were written over a long period of time. They're blogs, they're short stories. And I've had the idea for a long time to bring these stories together for two reasons. One, I believe many of the stories are inspirational and will give people hope. Some of the stories are funny. They're real life, just about what goes on in an everyday life. But I also thought there's other writers out there who have stories to tell. Their stories are different, but they maybe want to write and they don't know how to find the time. The word time was very important to me. In fact, originally I thought the subtitle of this book was going to be Someday When I Have the Time. And there just was not time to write. So I wanted to bring the stories together for people to find hope along life's journey, but also for writers to see I really can find some time. I really can. And I can bring my book to fruition. So my book, Someday I Will Write, is a collection of my stories. They're stories about my life. They're stories about my ancestors. And I had to come up with a way to put all of these stories together. One thing I do want to say, the stories were already written. I did not have to write new stories to bring this book together. The introduction was actually a blog that was written for my first publisher. The conclusion was a blog I wrote on my own website after receiving some criticism. It was already written. The only piece that I had to really write for the book was the preface to explain to you why I wrote the book. I also, however, wrote a little piece after each story for writers to let them know either why I wrote it, if it got published, if there's maybe a little aftermath to the story, to try to encourage writers to tell their own stories. So how did I bring all these stories together? Because they are not in chronological order. Well, I told you that the word time was always important to me. And so I had this idea to group my stories according to the seasons of life. And I could not help but remember the scripture that's very popular, Ecclesiastes 3. There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. That's Ecclesiastes 3:1. So that became my epigraph. The epigraph is the very brief quote at the beginning of the book. And then for my epilogue at the end of the book, I actually finished out that entire passage of scripture, which says a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What do workers gain from their toil? I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart, yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. So I read to you the beginning, the epigraph, and the ending, the epilogue. And so I had to come up with a way to organize my stories. And I decided to break them into 5 sections. And these were the 5 sections that I chose. Part 1 is a time to remember. Part 2, a time to hope and a time to faith, for faith. A time to hope and a time for faith. Part 3, a time for family. Part 4, a time to let go. Part 5, a time to work and a time to play. And so those are the 5 sections of my book. I have a preface, an introduction, and a conclusion. And I encourage you, when you get the book, to read the preface and read the introduction. And they were all stories already written, but it will explain my writing journey. And then in the middle, all of these stories that I wrote, I do believe that you will find something in there for you. Maybe it's a time in your life where you need hope. You need to hang on to hope. You'll see how I hung on to hope. Or a time where you need to just encourage yourself and have faith. Maybe it's a season of life where you're raising your family. I've got a time for family. I've got a time to remember my ancestors and remember my past. And then there's a time to let go of things, so I have a few regrets and a few losses. And maybe that's where you're at. And then the very last section, and this is where maybe I've had a little bit of fun, but it's a time to work. Yes, I've had a career my whole life, and a time to play. And so that is the way this book, Someday I Will Write, is organized. I hope this helps you a little bit. Again, it's update number 12 to Someday I Will Write. It will be available and will go on sale November 19.